They told us the campaign would last 6 days. I want you to understand that before I tell you anything else. 6 days. That was the figure printed across every briefing slate, spoken in every wardroom, repeated by every officer above me until it stopped being a prediction and became a kind of prayer. 6 days to break a young species. 6 days to fold their governments, silence their networks, and plant the Dominion standard on the largest of their landmasses. We had done it 41 times before, against 41 worlds, and not once had the number been wrong by more than a day. I am Oran. In your tongue the closest sound is Oran, though my full designation runs longer and would mean nothing to you. I served as a third-tier observation officer aboard the dreadnought Quiet Until Asked, which is a poor translation of a name that meant something closer to a blade kept sheathed out of mercy rather than fear. I tell you my rank so you understand I was nobody. I gave no orders. I pressed no fire. My task was to watch, to record, to feed the patterns I saw back up the chain, so that those above me could decide which city to silence next. I was very good at watching. It is the one thing I can still claim with a clear conscience. What I watched over those days that were never 6 changed what I believe about the shape of the universe. I have lived a long time since. I have told this account to my own young ones, and to the young ones of officers who did not live to tell their own. And every time I begin the same way, because it is the truest thing I know. We thought we understood what humans were. We were wrong in a way that should frighten every species that still draws breath. Let me take you back. The fleet gathered beyond the orbit of the ringed gas world your people call Saturn, in the cold dark where their primitive sensors could not yet reach. There were 216 vessels of war. Arranged in the layered shell formation, the Dominion had perfected over 900 cycles of conquest. The Quiet Until Asked sat at the heart of it, and from the observation gallery where I worked, I could see the whole arrangement spread across the void like scales on the flank of some vast sleeping thing. It was beautiful. I will not pretend otherwise. There is a beauty to overwhelming force that no honest soldier denies. Our fleet mind was called Sevis, and Sevis was as confident as the rest of us. I remember the briefing it gave in the final hour before we crossed into the system proper. It spoke in the flat, certain cadence of a being that had never been surprised. Target species, it said, was technologically adolescent. They had split their own atom but not yet learned to live in peace with the knowledge. They had walked on the small gray moon that circled their world and then, strangely, stopped, as if frightened of their own reach. They were divided into hundreds of competing factions that spent more energy fighting one another than building anything together. They had no orbital defense network worth the name. Their largest weapons could scratch our hulls and nothing more. Most importantly, Sevis said they were fragile, soft-bodied, short-lived with spans of perhaps 80 or 90 of their years against the 400 of an average Thren. They felt pain acutely. They bled easily. They formed deep attachments to their offspring and their territory and their dead, attachments that could be exploited, pressured, broken. This was doctrine. This was the Dominion way. You do not destroy a young species. You break its will. You strike the centers of its power. You sever its means of speaking to itself, and you wait. Within days, the surviving leadership sues for terms. Within a season, the population is integrated into the labor tiers. Within a generation, they forget they were ever free, and their descendants build our ships and mine our worlds and never know there had been another way to live. It was efficient. It was, by the cold arithmetic of empire, even merciful. Fewer died this way than in the long grinding wars the old conquerors had fought. I believed all of it. That is the part I find hardest to say, even now. I was not a cruel creature. I had a family on the homeworld, a bonded partner named Isla and 2 young ones who I missed with an ache that never fully left me. I told myself I served so that they would be safe, so that the Dominion would endure, so that order would hold against the chaos of an indifferent galaxy. I told myself that the species we broke were lucky to be broken cleanly. And when I looked down at the blue world growing in our forward viewers, swirled with white and webbed with the faint lights of their cities on the night side. I felt nothing but the calm of a being doing necessary work. The first thing that went wrong was so small that I almost did not log it. We expected silence on first contact. That is the pattern. A young species, suddenly aware that 200 warships have appeared in its sky, goes quiet. Their leaders gather in secret. Their networks fill with panic that they try to suppress. There is a period of perhaps a day where they say nothing to us at all because they do not yet know what to say, and in that silence we begin our work. The humans did not go silent. Within 40 minutes of our fleet becoming visible to their instruments, we received a transmission, not from a single government, from dozens of them on overlapping channels in their many languages, and the strange thing, the thing I flagged in my first report, was that the messages did not agree with one another. Some were threats, some were pleas for parley, some were simply demands to know who we were and what we wanted. One transmission, which our linguists struggled for an hour to parse, turned out to be a single human, broadcasting from a private station, asking us with what I can only describe as furious curiosity whether we had come in peace, and if not, whether we had any idea what we were getting ourselves into. I remember Sevis dismissing it. Noise, it said. The chatter of a frightened animal that has not yet organized itself. Wait, it said. They will organize. They will choose leaders to speak for them. And when those leaders are dead, the rest will fall quiet. So we struck the centers of power. I will not describe the orbital bombardment in detail. I have tried in other tellings, and I find I cannot do it without my account becoming something else, something closer to confession than memory. I will tell you only what is necessary. We targeted their capitals, their seats of government, their military command nodes, their largest financial centers. We struck with precision weapons designed to collapse the structures of power while leaving the surrounding population largely intact, because a broken population that still lives is a labor tier, and a dead one is only ash. Even our cruelty had its logic. The strike succeeded. I watched the readouts confirm it, one center after another going dark. By the end of the first day, by every metric the Dominion had ever used, the human leadership had been decapitated. Their command structures were in ruins. Their lines of communication, the great networks they relied upon, were shattered in 100 places. By the pattern, this was the moment they should have begun to fall quiet. Instead, the noise grew louder. I want you to sit with how strange this was to us. We had a model of how a species dies. You cut off the head and the body stops moving. We had seen it 41 times. It was as reliable to us as the fact that a star burns or that the void is cold. And here was a species whose head we had cut off, and the body was not only still moving, it was moving faster, more frantically, in 1,000 directions at once. My second report flagged the anomaly. The humans were not waiting for new leaders. They were not gathering in secret to choose someone to speak for them. They were simply continuing to act, each fragment of their shattered society doing whatever seemed best to it, with no central direction at all. A military base whose command had been destroyed did not stand down to await orders. It began organizing its own defense. A city whose government had been obliterated did not collapse into paralysis. Its people began on their own to evacuate the vulnerable, to ration supplies, to fortify. There was no plan. There was no coordinator. There was just an entire species refusing, individual by individual, to do the one thing every other species had done. They refused to stop. Sevis adjusted its projections. 6 days became 8, then 10. It was not concerned, it told the command tier. The species was merely more decentralized than anticipated. This was inefficient for them in the long run. A creature with no head bleeds out, it said, even if it thrashes for a while. We had only to maintain pressure. I was not so certain, though I lacked the standing to say so. Something in the human noise had begun to bother me, and it took me 3 days to understand what it was. It was not the volume of their transmissions. It was the content. As I sorted through the flood of intercepted communications, building the patterns my superiors wanted, I began to notice something I had never seen in any other conquest. The humans were not only coordinating their defense, they were talking to each other about us. They were sharing everything they learned. A weapons profile observed by one group in one part of the world would appear, within hours, in the communications of groups on the other side of the planet who had never met the first. A weakness in our dropcraft armor, noticed by a single defending unit, would spread across their fractured networks like fire across dry grass, until thousands of separate fighters who had no common command all knew the same thing. They were not one mind. They were not even many minds working as one. They were something I had no word for. They were many minds, each fiercely separate, each refusing to be ruled, and yet pouring everything they discovered into a common pool from which any of them could drink. We had broken their structure and found, beneath it, something we could not break because it had no structure to break. It was just the simple, stubborn habit of telling each other the truth about what was trying to kill them. I logged this. I do not think anyone above me read it carefully. We were still winning by the only measures the Dominion respected. Our casualties were minimal. Their cities were burning. Our ground forces had begun their descent. That is when I saw a human up close for the first time. We had captured a small group of them during a landing operation in a region of broad grasslands and shattered industrial sprawl. They were brought aboard the Quiet until asked for examination, because Sevis wanted to understand why the species was behaving so far outside the pattern, and you cannot fully understand a creature from orbit. I was assigned to observe the examination, to record the subject's responses, to build a profile of their psychology that the interrogation tier could exploit. There were 5 of them. 4 were soldiers, still in the torn and scorched coverings of their kind, hands bound, faces set in the particular blankness that I would later learn was not calm but the most disciplined kind of fear. The 5th was smaller, and at first I could not place its role. It wore no uniform. It was younger than the others, and when I consulted the records of the capture, I learned that it was not a soldier at all. It was a civilian, a young female who had been pulled from the rubble of a collapsed structure by one of the soldiers and who had refused, when our forces closed in, to be separated from the creature that had saved her. Her name, I would learn, was Mara. The soldier who had carried her out of the rubble was named Eli Brandt, and he was a sergeant, which in their hierarchy is a leader of small groups, the rank at which an army is held together by individuals rather than by orders from above. I did not know any of this at the time. At the time, I knew only that there were 5 soft-bodied creatures in the examination chamber, and that they were the enemy, and that I was there to watch them break. They did not break. I had observed examinations before. I knew the stages. There is the initial defiance, which is shallow and quickly exhausted. There is the bargaining, where the subject tries to trade information for comfort. There is the collapse, where the subject understands its helplessness and begins to say whatever it believes its captors wish to hear. Every species moves through these stages. The timing varies. The stages do not. The humans did not move through the stages. The soldiers said nothing at all, not even defiance, which unsettled the interrogation tier because there was nothing to push against. They simply looked at their captors with those small, wet eyes and waited, and when pressure was applied, they endured it, and when more pressure was applied, they endured that too, and the only thing that ever broke through their silence was when the interrogators turned their attention toward the young female. Then the largest of the soldiers, the one called Brandt, spoke for the first time. He did not plead. He did not bargain. He looked at the interrogation officer, a Thren of high rank named Vasandre, and he said in his own language, which the translators rendered for us, that whatever they wanted to do, they could do to him. "Leave the kid alone," he said. "She's not part of this." Vasandre, who had broken the will of 3 species, did not understand what he was looking at. None of us did. To us, this was incomprehensible. The soldier had nothing to gain by drawing attention to himself. He was offering to absorb suffering that was not required of him, for a creature that was not his offspring, that shared no bond of blood or rank with him, that he had known for less than a day. By every model the Dominion possessed, this was irrational. It was a flaw. Vasandre saw it as a flaw, a soft place in the species, a lever. He ordered the young female brought forward. I will tell you what happened then, and I will tell you that it is the moment my certainty began to die, though I did not understand that yet either. The 4 soldiers who had endured everything in silence came apart, not into pleading, into fury. The bound creatures, weaponless, outnumbered, surrounded by beings twice their size and infinitely beyond their technology, threw themselves against their restraints with a violence that I had never seen in any captured creature, a violence that had no hope of accomplishing anything except to say, with their whole bodies, that this would not happen while they lived. One of them tore something in his own shoulder doing it. I heard the wet sound of it. He did not stop. And the young female, Mara, who should by every model have been the most frightened creature in the chamber, who was small and unarmed and surrounded by monsters, did something I have never been able to forget. She stopped struggling against the guard who held her. She went very still, and then she looked, not at her captors, but at the soldier called Brant, who was bleeding from his torn shoulder and straining against his bonds toward her, and she said something to him. The translators caught it. She said, "It's okay. It's okay. Don't, I'm okay." She was comforting him. A child, in the hands of an enemy that had burned her world, surrounded by death, was using what might have been her last words to ease the suffering of the creature who could not save her. I did not record that the way I was supposed to. I logged it as an emotional anomaly, a stress response, the kind of dry phrase that lets an officer file away something he does not want to think about. But I thought about it. I thought about it that night in my quarters when the work was done, and I found that I could not make it fit anywhere in the architecture of belief I had carried my whole life. We had been told that humans were fragile because they felt pain so acutely, because they formed such deep attachments, because they would do anything to protect their offspring and their territory and their dead. We had been told these were weaknesses, levers, soft places to press. But I had just watched 4 soldiers nearly tear themselves apart, not to save themselves, but to protect a child none of them had known a day before. I had watched a child use her fear to comfort her protector instead of to beg for her own life. And it occurred to me slowly, with the kind of dread that comes when a foundation you have stood on your whole life shifts beneath you, that we had not been looking at a weakness at all. We had identified the single most dangerous quality a species can possess, and we had filed it under fragility. Because a creature that will only fight for itself can be made to stop. You only have to convince it that fighting is no longer in its interest. But a creature that will fight and bleed and die for something outside itself, for a child it just met, for a stranger, for an idea, for a world, that creature cannot be made to stop by any pressure we knew how to apply. You cannot convince it that surrender is in its interest, because its interest was never the thing it was fighting for. I did not sleep that night. I am not sure, looking back, that I ever fully slept again. The examination ended without yielding what Vasandre wanted. The soldiers told us nothing. They were returned to a holding tier to be processed for the labor pools, which was, by Dominion standards, mercy, because a less efficient empire would simply have killed them. The young female was to be separated from them and held elsewhere. I watched them taken away. The soldier Brant, his shoulder ruined, met my eyes as he was led past my station. I do not know what he saw in my face. I did not know what was in my face. But he held my gaze for a moment, and there was no fear in his, only a kind of weary, furious patience, the look of a creature who has decided that no matter how this ends, it will not be the one to flinch. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself we were still winning. And we were by the numbers. That is the cruelest part of what I have to tell you. For all that I had begun to feel the ground shift, the Dominion was still, by every chart and projection, on the verge of victory. Their cities burned. Their leadership was gone. Their armies were scattered and outmatched. Sevis projected the campaign would conclude within 12 days, only 6 longer than promised, a minor variance against the scale of the conquest. But I had begun to understand something that Sevis, for all its vast and ancient intelligence, could not. Sevis measured the war in cities taken and command structures broken and forces destroyed. It was very good at measuring those things. It had measured them across 41 worlds and had never been wrong. It did not know how to measure the thing I had seen in that examination chamber. It had no instrument for it. There was no readout for a child comforting her protector, no sensor that could detect 4 bound soldiers choosing to bleed for a stranger. These things did not appear on any chart, and so, to Sevis, they did not exist, and the war proceeded toward its certain conclusion exactly as planned. I knew better, and I could not have told you why. I only knew that I had looked into the eyes of a creature we were supposed to be breaking, and I had not seen anything that was breaking. I had seen something gathering, something patient, something that was, in its quiet and furious way, taking the measure of us exactly as we believed we were taking the measure of it. On the 9th day, the day the humans stopped only defending and began, for the first time, to come for us, I understood that the question had never been whether we would break them. The question, the only question that had ever mattered, was what we had woken up. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before the 9th day, before the thing they did to our forward fleet, before I learned what the human noise had truly been building toward in all those days we mistook for chaos, there was the matter of the ground war, and the city they called Resolute, and the night I came down through the atmosphere myself, and saw, with my own eyes, what it meant to fight a species that had decided it would rather die standing than live on its knees. Let me tell you about the descent. I had never been planetside on a conquest before. Observation officers do not, as a rule, leave the safety of the fleet. But Sevis had grown frustrated with the quality of our ground intelligence, with the way the humans kept doing things our orbital sensors could not explain, and it ordered observers embedded with the forward landing groups to report directly on what was happening in the cities. I was chosen, I suspect, precisely because my reports had been flagging anomalies the command tier did not want to hear. Send the one who keeps seeing ghosts, I imagine someone said. Let him go and find that there are no ghosts. So on the 7th day I was loaded into a drop craft with a unit of ground troops under a field commander named Hesk, and I fell through the sky of the world we were conquering, and the first thing I noticed, even before we landed, was the smell. You do not think of a world as having a smell until you fall into one. Earth had a smell, even through the filters of my breathing apparatus, even through the smoke and the burning. It smelled green and wet and alive in a way that the recycled air of the fleet had made me forget air could smell. It smelled like the homeworld must have smelled once, before we paved it over with the machinery of empire. And I remember thinking, in the half-instant before we hit the ground and the noise of the war swallowed everything, that we had crossed half the galaxy to take a world that smelled like home, from creatures who were defending it the way I would have defended mine. I did not have time to finish the thought. The drop craft hit the ground, the hatch opened, and the war came in. The first thing that came through the open hatch was sound. Not the clean reports of our weapons, which I knew, but a chaos of overlapping noise I had no names for. Cracks and roars and a high mechanical chatter that I learned later was a human weapon firing many small projectiles in a stream, a crude thing by our standards, a thing that should not have worked against our armor and somehow, in enough quantity, from enough angles, did. The troops poured out around me into the smoke, and Commander Hesk's voice came over the unit channel telling them to hold formation, to advance to the marked position, and for the first few moments it was exactly as the doctrine promised. We were stronger. We were better armed. The humans fell back before us. Then they stopped falling back, and I began to learn what kind of war I had walked into. We had landed at the edge of a city. Our charts named it by a long string of human designations, but the humans themselves, on their networks, had taken to calling it Resolute, which was not its true name but a thing they had begun calling it after the bombardment, the way a creature gives itself a new name to remind itself who it has decided to be. It had been a large city once. Now it was a landscape of broken structures and standing fires, and somewhere in that broken landscape were the humans who had refused to leave it. I stayed close to Hesk's command element, which kept to the rear of the advance, and I watched through my recording apparatus and through my own eyes, and I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Our forces moved in the disciplined wedge formations the Dominion had used for 900 cycles, and at first the humans seemed to have no answer for it. They had no formations of their own. They did not mass against us. They appeared in ones and twos and small handfuls, fired and vanished into the ruins before our weapons could find them. To Hesk this was a sign of their disorganization. To me, watching the patterns, it began to look like something else. They were not disorganized, they were everywhere. There was no front line. That was the thing I could not make our command tier understand, then or for days afterward. In every conquest before this one there had been a front, a place where the defending force ended and the conquered ground began, and you pushed the front forward and the war moved with it. Here there was no front. We would clear a structure, declare the ground behind us secure, advance, and the humans we thought we had cleared would rise out of cellars and tunnels and the wreckage we had walked past and strike us from behind. Ground we had taken did not stay taken. There was no behind. The whole city was the front, and the front was inside the city, and the humans moved through it like blood through a body, closing around every wound we made. I watched a wedge of our troops, 14 strong, advance up a broad avenue toward an objective Hesk had marked. They were good soldiers. They moved well, and the humans let them come, let them reach the open ground at the center of the avenue, and then brought down the structures on either side. Not with weapons we could have countered. With explosives the humans had placed themselves, in their own city, in the buildings they had lived in, prepared to destroy their own homes to bury our soldiers in the rubble. The wedge vanished under a mountain of stone and twisted metal. 6 survived. Hesk pulled them back and marked the avenue as too costly to take, and I understood, watching him do it, that the humans had won that ground not by being stronger but by being willing to lose more of it than we were. This is the thing I want you to understand about how they fought. We came to that world believing we held every advantage, and by every measure of force we did. But war is not only force. War is also the question of what each side is willing to spend, and we had badly, catastrophically miscalculated what the humans were willing to spend. We had assumed they valued the things we valued. We had assumed they would not destroy their own cities to deny them to us, would not bury their own dead under rubble they raised on purpose, would not trade 3 of their lives for 1 of ours over and over, until the arithmetic of the campaign turned against us. We assumed this because no species we had ever conquered had been willing to do these things. And the humans did all of them, without hesitation in the first days, while still, I remind you, fighting without any central command to order them to. No one told them to defend resolute. There was no government left to issue the order. They simply decided, each of them, that they would, and then they told each other what they had decided, and the decision spread across their broken networks the way everything spread, and a city that had no army became an army. On the second day of the ground war, I saw the thing that I have carried with me longest, longer even than the examination chamber. I want to tell it to you carefully, because it is the heart of what I learned. Hesk's element had taken shelter in the lower floors of a partly collapsed structure, while a storm of human fire pinned the advance. We had wounded with us, 3 Thren soldiers hurt badly enough that they could not move on their own, and Hesk had made the decision, a sound one by our doctrine, to hold position and let the wounded stabilize before we pushed on. I was crouched near a gap in the wall, recording, when I saw movement in the rubble of the structure across the street. A human had emerged, not a soldier, an older male by the gray in the hair on his head, moving with the careful slowness of an aged creature, and he was not armed. He was carrying something in both arms, cradled against his body the way I had seen the soldier carry the child Mara. I trained my apparatus on him, expecting a weapon, expecting a trick. It was not a weapon. It was a container of water, and beside him, behind him, came others, two younger humans, also unarmed, also carrying water and bundles of cloth and small cases of the supplies their kind used to tend wounds. They were crossing the open street, under fire, the same street where our soldiers had been buried 2 days before, and they were doing it to reach a structure further down where, I realized as I watched, there were human wounded crying out. Their own injured, trapped between the lines, where neither side could safely reach them. And these unarmed old creatures had decided that the wounded would not be left to die alone, and so they walked out into the killing ground with water and bandages slowly, in the open, where any of our soldiers could have ended them with a single shot. I should have ordered them targeted. That was my duty. They were enemy non-combatants moving to aid enemy wounded, and Dominion doctrine is explicit that the line between combatant and non-combatant among a resisting population is a fiction maintained by the weak. I had the authority to mark them. The soldiers beside me had the weapons to obey. I did not give the order. I have asked myself, across all the years since, why I did not, and the truest answer I can give is that I had stopped being able to see them as a target. I saw 3 old creatures walking through fire to bring water to the dying, and somewhere in me a structure that had held my whole life finished its long collapse, quietly, without any sound at all, the way the deepest things break. But I was not the only one watching. A soldier near me, a young friend named Corin, raised his weapon. He had the same training I had. He saw enemy non-combatants and he prepared to do his duty. And I put my hand on his weapon and pushed it down. And when he turned to me, confused, his question plain in the set of his crest, I said the only thing I could think of, which was that they posed no threat and the discharge would give away our position. It was a lie wrapped around a truth, the way mercy often has to be when you have forgotten how to speak it plainly. He believed me. He lowered the weapon. And the 3 old humans crossed the whole length of that terrible street, unharmed, and reached the structure where the wounded were, and I watched the older male kneel in the rubble beside a human soldier whose leg was crushed, and pour water past the soldier's lips, and hold his hand, and I recorded all of it, and I could not have told you in that moment which side I was on. Here is what undid me about it. By Dominion thinking, what those old humans did was foolish. It accomplished nothing strategic. The wounded they reached were going to die or be captured regardless. They risked 3 lives and gained, in the cold arithmetic, nothing. A rational creature does not do this. A creature that fights only for its own survival does not do this. But I had begun to understand, slowly, that the humans were not fighting for their own survival. Or rather, that survival for them meant something larger than the continuation of their individual bodies. They were fighting to remain the kind of creatures who walk into fire to bring water to the dying. They were fighting to not become the kind of creatures who leave their wounded in the street. And you cannot defeat a species that is fighting for that, because there is nothing you can take from them that will make them surrender it. You can take their cities. You can take their lives. The one thing you cannot take, the one thing that is not yours to take, is their decision about what kind of creatures they will be while you are taking everything else. We thought we had come to conquer a world. We had come to conquer a decision, and it could not be conquered because it was renewed every day in every one of them by their own free choosing, faster than we could destroy it. I sent this in my report. I phrased it as carefully as I could, in the dry language of an observation officer, because I knew that if I phrased it as I have just phrased it to you, I would be relieved of my post and possibly worse. I wrote that the target species exhibited a defensive resilience rooted in distributed decision-making, and a value structure that prioritized collective and abstract objectives over individual survival, rendering standard pressure-based subjugation doctrine ineffective. I wrote that the projected timeline should be revised significantly upward. I wrote that the campaign, as currently conceived, might not be winnable by the means we had brought. I do not know if anyone read it. I know that the campaign continued exactly as before. On the 5th day of the ground war, the 8th day overall, Commander Hesk's element finally reached its objective, a fortified position the humans had built in the center of Resolute, around a structure that had once been some kind of civic hall. We had been told to take it because the human resistance in the city seemed to flow outward from it, and Sevis believed it was a command node, a place where the humans were coordinating their defense. Take the node, the logic ran, and the defense would lose its coherence. It was not a command node. I understood that the moment we breached it, because there was nothing in it that any Dominion mind would have recognized as command. There were no officers. There was no equipment for coordinating forces. There were perhaps 200 humans, most of them not soldiers, and they were not coordinating anything. They were sheltering the city's most vulnerable, the very young and the very old and the injured, and they were defending them. And the reason the resistance flowed outward from that place was not that orders came from it, but that everyone in the city had decided, without being told, that whatever else fell, that place would not. We took it anyway. I will not pretend we did not. We were too strong for 200 mostly unarmed humans, however willing they were to spend themselves, and Hesk's element breached the position and the defenders fell, almost all of them, fighting in front of the very young and the very old, who they pushed behind them with their own bodies even as they died. And when it was over, when the firing stopped and the smoke began to clear, and the surviving humans, the children and the aged and the wounded, were herded into the center of that ruined hall under our weapons, I saw a thing I will describe to you exactly, because it is the last thing I need you to understand before I can tell you about the 9th day. A human child, very small, perhaps 4 or 5 of their years, had been separated from whatever adult had been protecting it. The adult was among the dead. The child stood alone in the open, in the smoke, surrounded by the soldiers of the empire that had killed its world, and it was not crying. It was looking around itself, searching, and it walked on its small, unsteady legs, not away from our soldiers, not into hiding, but toward the nearest wounded human, an injured woman lying against the rubble, a stranger, and it knelt down beside her and took her hand, exactly as the old male had taken the hand of the dying soldier in the street, and it held on. A child, with no one left to teach it, with every reason to hide or to weep or to run. And the first thing it did, alone in the wreckage of everything, was find someone who was hurting and refuse to let them be hurting alone. That is when I knew with a certainty that has never left me that we had lost, not the battle. We won the battle. We took Resolute, what was left of it. We lost something larger. Something that had nothing to do with cities or weapons or the projections of Sevis. We had come to a world believing we would teach its people what it meant to be conquered, and instead its smallest and most broken creatures had taught me, an officer of the conquering empire, what it meant to be unconquerable, and I could not unlearn it. I stood in that ruined hall and I watched a child hold a stranger's hand in the smoke, and I understood that there was no force in the Dominion's vast and terrible arsenal that could reach the thing that made that child do that. We could kill every human on that world. We were, I feared, going to try. But we could not make them stop being what they were while they lived, and as long as even one of them lived and chose to hold a stranger's hand in the smoke, the thing we had come to conquer would still be there, undefeated, unbroken, looking back at us out of small, wet eyes that held no surrender at all. I requested to be returned to the fleet that night. I told my superiors I had gathered sufficient ground intelligence. The truth was that I could not stay on that world another day without coming apart entirely, and I needed the cold, recycled air of the quiet until asked, and the distance of orbit to hold myself together. I went up through the same sky I had fallen through. I looked down at the burning cities and the dark seas and the green places that still, somehow, smelled like home, and I carried with me the certainty that the war was already lost, and the knowledge that no one above me would believe it, because by every measure they trusted, we were winning. I was right about the war. I was wrong about the timing. I thought we had years of grinding ruin ahead, the slow bleeding out of a campaign that could not achieve its ends. I did not know that the humans, in all those days we mistook for chaos, in all that noise we dismissed as the thrashing of a headless body, had been building towards something. I did not know what their endless talking to each other had truly been for. I did not know that a species with no central command could still, given enough days and enough shared truth, decide as one to do something none of us had imagined a young species could do. On the 9th day, they stopped defending. On the 9th day, for the first time they came for us. And what they did to our forward fleet, in the dark beyond their small gray moon, is the thing I have spent the rest of my life trying to find words for. It is the reason I tell this account at all. It is the moment the galaxy should have learned, and mostly chose to forget, exactly what it had woken when it looked at the small blue world and saw only an adolescent species, fragile and divided and ripe for the breaking. I will tell you about the 9th day. But not yet. Some things have to be approached the way you approach a wound, slowly with your breath held, knowing it is going to hurt. Let me gather myself. Let me tell you first about the quiet aboard the fleet in the hours before it happened. The false and total quiet of an empire that believed it had already won. So that you will understand, as I came to understand, that there is no silence in the universe more dangerous than the silence of the confident, and no sound more terrible than the one that breaks it. Let me tell you about the quiet first. When I returned to the asterisk quiet until asked on the 8th night, the fleet had the particular stillness of a thing that believes its work is nearly done. You could feel it in the corridors. The tension that had filled the early days, the alertness of crews who did not yet know how the campaign would go, had bled away and left something softer in its place. Officers spoke of the homeworld. They spoke of the bonuses that came with a completed conquest, of the labor tiers that would soon be filling with human workers, of how this one had taken a little longer than promised but would be remembered, like all the others, as a clean and total victory. Sevis had revised its projection one final time. The campaign would conclude within the next several days. The human resistance, it said, was burning itself out. They had spent themselves defending cities that could not be held. Their losses were catastrophic and unsustainable. Ours remained, by the cold accounting of the fleet, minimal. By every measure Sevis trusted, the war was over but for the formalities. I knew it was not over. I had stood in the ruins of Resolute and watched a child hold a stranger's hand in the smoke, and I had understood that we had not touched the thing that mattered. But I could not make the fleet feel what I had felt. My reports sat in the system, read or unread, dry phrases that no one above me knew how to translate back into the living dread I had carried up from the surface. And so I held my silence, and I moved through the quiet corridors of a confident empire, and I waited for something I could not name. The prisoners were still aboard. I want you to know that because it matters for what comes after. The 5 we had captured, the 4 soldiers and the child Mara, had been processed but not yet transferred to the labor pools, held in a detention tier 2 decks below the observation gallery, while the interrogation officers decided whether they had any further use. I had not gone to see them. I told myself there was no reason to. The truth was that I was afraid of them, in a way I could not have explained to anyone aboard that ship. I was afraid of what I might see in their faces, and more than that, I was afraid of what they might see in mine. I did go, in the end. On the 8th night, unable to rest, I went down to the detention tier, and I told the guard there that I needed to observe the prisoners for my reports, which was a lie, and he let me pass, because no one questions an observation officer doing what observation officers do. They were in a holding cell behind a transparent barrier, the 5 of them together, which I learned later was an oversight, a thing that should not have happened, because Dominion doctrine separates prisoners to break their cohesion. But the fleet was confident, and confident creatures grow careless, and so the 4 soldiers and the child had been left together, and the sergeant called Brant, his ruined shoulder bound now in our medical wrapping, sat with the child Mara leaned against his side asleep, and the other 3 soldiers sat near them, awake, watchful, and when I appeared at the barrier they all looked at me at once. I did not speak. I do not know what I had come to say. I stood there in the dim light of the detention tier and I looked at them, and the sergeant looked back at me, and after a long moment he spoke. The barrier carried his words to the translator at my collar, and the translator gave them to me in the flat synthetic cadence that strips all the feeling out, but I did not need the feeling to be carried. It was in his face. He said, "You were there, on the ship, when they brought us in. You're the one who didn't look away." I did not answer. I could not. He studied me, this soft-bodied creature with his crushed shoulder and his sleeping child, and he said something then that I have turned over in my mind for the rest of my life. He said, "I don't know what you are or why you're here or what your people thought they'd find when they came, but you've seen us now. You've been down there, so you know we're not going to stop." I said, because it was the only true thing I had, that I knew. And he nodded slowly as if I had confirmed something he had already decided, and he said, "Then you should be afraid, not of what we'll do to you, of what you've already done. You came a long way to wake something up and you woke it, and now you have to live in a galaxy where it's awake." He looked down at the child sleeping against his side and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "She's going to grow up. One way or another, some of them always do, and she's going to remember who did this. We all are. You don't get to do what you did and have us forget." I left the detention tier. I did not go back. I went up to the observation gallery and I sat in the dark looking down at the blue world, and I tried to tell myself he was wrong, that it was the empty defiance of a defeated creature, the kind of thing the conquered always say. But I had been to the surface. I had seen the child in the smoke, and I knew with the cold certainty that had not left me since Resolute that he was not defiant. He was simply telling me the truth, the way his whole species told each other the truth, plainly, without decoration, as a thing that needed to be known. He was telling me that we had not won. He was telling me the bill had not yet come. It came on the 9th day. I have spoken to other survivors in the years since, and we do not agree on when exactly it began. The fleet's own records, what survived of them, place the first contact at a particular hour, but the truth is that it had begun days before, in all that human noise we had dismissed, and we simply did not see it until it reached us. Let me tell you what we understood only afterward, when it was far too late, because you need to understand it to understand the 9th day at all. In all those days we mistook for the thrashing of a headless body, the humans had been doing the one thing they did better than any species I have ever encountered. They had been telling each other everything. Every weapon profile, every armor weakness, every formation, every pattern of our movement, every fragment of our technology they had captured or observed, all of it poured into the common pool from which any of them could drink. We had watched them do it, and we had not understood what it was for. We thought it was panic, it was preparation. And there was one more thing, the thing Sevis missed entirely, the thing that no fleet mind built on 900 cycles of conquering organized species could have anticipated. The humans had figured out where we were. They had tracked our forward fleet to its position beyond their small gray moon, in the dark where we thought ourselves unseen. They had done it not through any single brilliant instrument, but through thousands of separate observers, amateur and professional, scattered across their whole world, each one watching the sky and sharing what they saw, until the collective eye of an entire species had pinpointed us with a precision no individual among them could have achieved. They knew where we were. They had been pooling everything they knew about how to hurt us, and they had been waiting, deliberately, patiently, drawing out their doomed defense of the cities, spending their lives to hold our attention on the surface, letting Sevis conclude the war was won, letting the fleet grow quiet and confident and careless. They had been waiting for the silence of the confident. When it came, they struck. The first warning we had was not a warning at all. It was a sensor return that Sevis initially classified as debris, a cloud of objects rising from the human world, crude and slow and chemical-fueled, The kind of primitive craft we had cataloged and dismissed in the first hour of the campaign. There were a great many of them. Sevis noted the number and judged it insignificant. The objects were too slow to threaten us, too primitive to penetrate our defenses, and there was no pattern to their movement, no formation, no coordination, nothing a fleet mind could recognize as an attack. They rose in their hundreds and then their thousands from every part of the human world on every trajectory with no order to them at all. And because there was no order, Sevis could not see the shape of what was coming, because it had no shape. It was just everything the humans had, all at once, flung at the sky. I was in the observation gallery when the first ones reached us. I saw it with my own eyes before the alarms understood what was happening. The humans had no warships. We had been right about that. They had never had warships. But they had spacecraft, hundreds of them, built for peaceful purposes, for carrying their people and their instruments into orbit. And they had the crude rockets they used to lift those craft. And they had the weapons Sevis had dismissed as able only to scratch our hulls, the weapons born from the splitting of their own atom. And in all those days of telling each other the truth, they had worked out a thing that we, in our 900 cycles of perfect doctrine, had never had cause to learn. A weapon that can only scratch a hull from a distance does something very different when it is carried to the hull and detonated against it. And a primitive craft that cannot threaten a warship in open battle becomes a terrible thing indeed when there is a living creature inside it who has decided, freely, with full knowledge, to fly it directly into the warship and not turn away. That was the thing Sevis could not model, not the technology. The technology was crude. What Sevis could not model was the choosing. Every defensive doctrine the Dominion possessed was built on the assumption that an attacker wishes to survive its attack. Our point defenses, our predictive intercepts, our entire layered shell formation, all of it was designed against enemies who maneuvered to strike and then escape, who broke off when the cost grew too high, who valued their own continuation. The humans did not break off. The humans did not maneuver to escape. There was nothing to predict, because there was no second half of the maneuver, no turning away, no preservation of self. There was only the choosing, made thousands of times over by thousands of separate creatures who had each decided that this was the thing they would spend their one short life to do. They came in from every angle at once, with no pattern because they had no command to give them one, and they did not stop, because not stopping was the entire weapon. I watched the first one strike. It was a small craft, slow, almost laughably primitive against the vast-scaled flank of the cruiser it approached, and the cruiser's point defenses fired and struck it and it broke apart. And for an instant I thought, with relief, that our defenses would hold, that the humans had flung themselves at us in vain. But the craft, even broken, even dying, kept coming, because there was no one left aboard it to do anything but keep coming. And what it carried reached the hull, and the cruiser, a warship that had crossed half the galaxy and conquered worlds, opened along its length like a fruit splitting in the heat, and the dark beyond the moon filled with a light I had never seen and never want to see again. And there were thousands of them. The fleet came apart in pieces, not all at once. That is the thing I remember, the slowness of it, the way it took time even though it felt like no time at all. The shell formation, our perfect layered shell, became the worst possible arrangement, because the humans came from everywhere and the ships on the outer layers could not maneuver without colliding with the ships behind them, and the ships in the inner layers could not see what was killing them until it had already arrived. Sevis tried to give orders. I heard them over the fleet channel, the fleet mind's flat certain voice growing, for the first time in 900 cycles, less certain, as it issued commands that assumed an enemy that wished to live and met an enemy that did not, and watched its commands accomplish nothing. Disperse, Sevis ordered, and the ships tried to disperse, and the humans simply followed them, because a craft with a dead pilot and a live weapon does not need to be clever. It only needs to keep going in the direction it was last pointed, and there were so many of them pointed in so many directions that there was nowhere to disperse to. Concentrate point defenses, Sevis ordered, and the ships concentrated their fire. And they could not fire fast enough, because for every craft they destroyed, the destroyed craft kept coming, and behind it were 10 more, and behind those, 10 more, an entire species worth of everything it had ever built to reach the sky, all of it arriving at once with a single shared intention that no fleet mind could disrupt because it had no center to strike. I have heard since the argument that the humans should not have been able to do it, that the numbers do not work, that crude craft and primitive weapons should not have been able to break a Dominion battle fleet. And those who make this argument are correct by the arithmetic. By the arithmetic, the fleet should have survived. Sevis had run the arithmetic. Sevis had concluded the humans could not hurt us. But the arithmetic assumed things the humans did not honor. It assumed that an attacker would not fly a craft worth 1,000 of his people's labor hours directly into a warship and die. It assumed that a species would not spend a generation's worth of its spacecraft in a single hour. It assumed that thousands of separate creatures, with no command structure, could not all choose the same terrible thing at the same time and execute it without coordination. The arithmetic was built for organized enemies who valued survival, and the humans were neither. And so the arithmetic was wrong in the only direction that mattered. I watched the asterisk quiet until asked take its first hit on the lower decks. I felt it through the structure of the ship, a shudder that ran up through the gallery floor, and then the alarms that had been confused became certain, and the calm of the confident fleet shattered all at once into something I had never heard aboard a Dominion warship. Fear, the real thing, the sound of a crew that had believed itself safe understanding in a single instant that it was not. The lights failed and came back red. The fleet channel filled with voices, overlapping, frantic, the disciplined order of the Dominion dissolving in real time into the same kind of desperate chaos we had dismissed in the humans 9 days before. And I understood, sitting in the red dark of the observation gallery with the ship dying around me, the full and final shape of what we had done. We had looked at a species that organized itself without rulers, that told each other the truth, that fought without a center and could not be decapitated, and we had called these things weakness. We had built our entire war on the certainty that they were weakness. And now the strongest fleet the Dominion had ever sent was being torn apart by exactly those things, by an enemy with no center to strike, no command to break, no fear of death to exploit, an enemy that had simply, freely, altogether decided. The asterisk quiet until asked was dying. I knew it the way you know a thing in your body before your mind accepts it. The hits were coming faster now, the humans having found us, the dreadnought at the heart of the formation, and a great many of them turning their crude, unstoppable craft toward the largest target in the dark. I should have gone to a survival pod. That was the protocol. Every instinct of self-preservation I possessed told me to go. I did not go to a survival pod. I went down, into the dying ship, toward the detention tier, because in the red dark with the alarm screaming and the empire I had served coming apart around me, I had thought of the 4 soldiers and the child, locked in a holding cell 2 decks down, and I understood that if I did nothing, they would die there, sealed behind a barrier on a warship that was tearing itself open, and that this, of all the things I had failed to prevent, would be the one I could not live with. I do not know, even now, exactly why. I had served the Dominion my whole life. They were the enemy. By every law I had ever obeyed, their deaths were nothing less than nothing, a rounding error in a campaign of millions. But I had stood in the ruins of Resolute and watched a child hold a stranger's hand in the smoke, and I had learned the thing that the humans had crossed the dark to teach an entire galaxy, whether it wished to learn it or not. I had learned that there are things a person decides about what kind of creature they will be, and that those decisions do not bend to arithmetic, or to empire, or to the certain voice of a fleet mind that has never once been surprised. I had decided. I think I had decided in the examination chamber, watching 4 bound soldiers nearly tear themselves apart to protect a child none of them had known a day before. I had simply not known it until the ship began to die, and I found my own feet carrying me down into the dark, against every protocol, against every instinct, toward a holding cell where 5 creatures of the species we had failed to conquer were waiting to find out whether anyone in all the cold machinery of the Dominion would choose, freely, with full knowledge, to come for them. I reached the detention tier. The corridor was full of smoke and the red light and the sound of the ship dying. The guard was gone, fled to a pod or to his duty station, and the holding cell's barrier still held, and behind it the 4 soldiers were on their feet, the child between them, and they were not panicking. They were watching the door. And when I came through it, when the Sergeant Brant saw me, an officer of the empire that had killed his world, standing in the smoke with the ship coming apart around us, I saw something cross his face that I had not expected and have never forgotten. He was not surprised. It was as if he had known. As if, when he had looked at me through the barrier the night before and told me I was the one who had not looked away, he had already seen this coming, already understood something about me that I had only just understood about myself. He looked at me standing there in the dying red light, and he did not ask why I had come. He simply moved the child behind him and set his feet and waited to see what the strange creature who had not looked away would do next. And I reached for the panel that controlled the barrier, with the ship screaming around us and the humans' unstoppable craft tearing the fleet apart in the dark beyond the hull. And I did the thing I had crossed my whole life to arrive at without ever knowing I was traveling toward it. But the panel was locked. Of course it was locked, and the lockout required an authorization I did not have, a command-tier clearance that I, a third-tier observation officer who had spent his career watching and recording and pressing no fire, had never been given. I stood there with my hand on a panel that would not open, on a ship that was dying, with 5 creatures behind a barrier I could not lift, and the whole weight of what I had decided crashed down against the simple mechanical fact that deciding is not the same as being able. That is where I have to stop for now. Not because the story stops, but because what happened next is the part I have spent the most years learning how to tell, and I will not rush it. There was a way through the lockout. There was a choice that came after it, harder than the first. And there was the question, which I could not yet answer, of what becomes of a creature who betrays the only people he has ever belonged to, in order to save the people he was sent to destroy, on a dying ship in the dark, where no one would ever know what he had done. Let me gather myself again. The hardest part is still ahead. The panel would not open, and the ship was dying, and I had perhaps moments before the choosing I had made became meaningless because I could not act on it. I want to tell you about those moments honestly, because they are where I learned the last thing I needed to learn, and it was not a noble thing. It was this. Deciding to be a certain kind of creature is the beginning. It is not the end. Between the decision and the deed there is always a locked panel, some hard mechanical fact that does not care what you have decided, and a great many creatures make the decision and then meet the locked panel and tell themselves, with relief, that they tried, that the universe would not let them, that it was out of their hands. I had nearly done it myself. My hand was already lifting off the panel. The thought was already forming, the comfortable thought, the one that would have let me flee to a survival pod with my decision intact and unspent. I tried, I would have told myself. There was a lockout. It was out of my hands. It was the child who stopped me. Through the barrier, the small one, Mara, was watching me. Not the sergeant, not the soldiers. The child, who had been asleep against Brant's side when I came down the night before, was awake now and watching me with those small dark eyes, and there was no fear in them. There was a question. She was watching me the way you watch someone deciding what they are, and I understood that whatever I did in the next moment, she would carry it. She would grow up, one way or another, some of them always do, and she would remember. She would remember whether the strange creature at the panel had tried, truly tried, or had only told himself a comfortable story and fled. I took my hand off the panel, and then I drove it through the maintenance hatch beside it instead. I am not a soldier. I had never in my life done violence with my own body. But the ship was dying, and dying ships have a mercy built into them that living ones do not. A set of emergency systems meant to free a trapped crew when the higher functions fail. The barrier's electronic lock answered to command clearance I did not have. But behind the maintenance hatch was a manual release, a crude mechanical thing, meant for exactly this, for the moment when the ship is coming apart and there is no time to ask permission, and it did not care about clearance, and it did not care that the creatures behind the barrier were prisoners rather than crew. It cared only that a living thing wished to be let out before the dark took it. The hatch tore the skin of my hand. The section behind it was venting, and the cold of the void reached in through the breach and burned me in the way only true cold can. And I got my torn hand around the manual release and I pulled, and the barrier between us failed and slid open, and the 4 soldiers and the child were free. The Sergeant Brant did not waste a moment on disbelief. That is a human thing I came to admire above almost all others, the speed with which they accept a changed world and act inside it. He had been ready, I think, for me to be a trick, for the open barrier to be the beginning of some final cruelty. When it was not, he simply moved. He had his soldiers up and moving before the barrier had finished sliding. The child gathered against him, and he looked at me, this creature of the empire that had killed his world, standing there bleeding from a torn hand on a dying ship, and he said one word. Where? Not why, not how. Where? He had already understood that I was getting them out, and the only thing that mattered now was the way. I think that is when I stopped being afraid of him. You cannot stay afraid of a creature who, freed from his cage by his enemy on a ship coming apart in the dark, wastes no breath on the wonder of it and asks only which way to run. I told him there was a launch bay 4 sections aft, and that the craft they had been captured in might still be there, undamaged in the secured hold where such things were kept for examination. It was a thin hope. The ship was dying. There was no reason to believe the bay was intact or the craft still flightworthy. But it was the only hope I had, and the sergeant heard it and nodded once and said, "Then we go aft," as if I had told him something simple and certain, and we went. I will not give you every step of that passage through the dying ship, because much of it has blurred in my memory into a single long horror of red light and screaming alarms, and the deep structural groans of a great vessel tearing itself apart. The humans behind their unstoppable craft were still striking us. I felt each hit through the failing floor. The corridors were full of smoke and the bodies of the crew, some fled, some dead, some too badly hurt to move, and we passed them, and I did not stop, because there was no time, and because I had made my choosing and it had a shape now, and the shape did not have room in it for everyone. That is the part I told you was not noble. I want you to sit with it. I led the enemies of my empire through my dying ship, past my own wounded crewmates who cried out to me for help, and I did not stop for them. I could not. There was no time and no way, and the choosing had its shape. I have made my peace with most of what I did in that war. I have never fully made my peace with that. But the humans did. We came, 3 sections aft, upon a Thren soldier pinned beneath fallen structure, alive, badly hurt, unable to free himself. I knew him. It was Corin, the young soldier from the ground war, the one I had stopped from firing on the 3 old humans crossing the killing ground with water and bandages. He had been transferred to the fleet as I had, and now he lay trapped in the dying ship, and when he saw me he called out, and then he saw what was with me. 4 human soldiers and a human child, his enemies, the creatures he had been sent to break, and his cry died in his throat, because he understood that the officer who had stopped him from firing was now leading the enemy through the ship, and would surely leave him to die. I did not stop. The choosing had its shape, and the shape was the humans, and I was already past him. The humans stopped. The Sergeant Brant stopped, and his soldiers stopped, and they looked at the trapped Thren, the enemy soldier, the one who would have killed them all without a thought 9 days before. And Brant said something to his soldiers in their own tongue fast, and two of them set down everything and went to the fallen structure and put their hands and their backs to it and lifted. These soft-bodied, short-lived creatures lifted the weight off the enemy who had come to conquer them and dragged him free. I stood there in the red light and I watched it, and I understood that the lesson I thought I had learned in Resolute had a second half I had not yet learned. In Resolute, I had learned that the humans would walk into fire to bring water to their own dying. Here, in the dying ship, I learned the rest of it. They would do it for the enemy too. The mercy was not for their own kind. The mercy was simply what they were, extended to whoever was in front of them, even the creature who had crossed the galaxy to break them, even the soldier who would have shot them down in the street and called it duty. Corin did not understand it. I saw his face as they pulled him free, the bewilderment in it, the same bewilderment Vassandre had worn in the examination chamber, the bewilderment of a creature whose entire model of the universe has just done something the model says is impossible. He had been taught, as I had been taught, that the human's attachments were weakness, levers, soft places to press. And now the soft place had reached down into the wreckage and lifted the weight off his crushed body and was dragging him toward the light, and there was no lever in it, nothing to press, nothing to gain. There was only the simple fact of what they were, and it was the most frightening and the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, and Corin, I think, never recovered from seeing it. I have spoken to him since. He left the Dominion's service within the cycle. He could not, he told me, go on serving an empire that had looked at that and called it weakness. We reached the launch bay with Corin half carried between two human soldiers. The bay was damaged but not destroyed, and the secured hold had held, and the captured human craft sat there in its examination cradle, the small, slow, primitive thing the four soldiers had been taken in, the thing Sevis had catalogued and dismissed. It was intact. Whether it would fly, none of us knew. And there it was, the harder choice, the one I told you came after the first. The craft would carry the humans. It might carry the wounded Thren, Corin, if the humans were willing, and they were, without being asked. But there was a question that had been waiting for me since I drove my hand through the maintenance hatch, and now it stood in front of me and would not be avoided. Would I go with them? If I stayed, I would die with my ship, an officer of the Dominion, and no one would ever know what I had done, and the comfortable story would write itself, that Orin the observation officer had perished in the line of duty when the human assault took the asterisk quiet until asked asterisk. My family on the homeworld would mourn a loyal servant of the Empire. My name would be clean. My bonded partner Isla and my two young ones would never know that I had ended my service by betraying everything it stood for. There is a kind of creature that would have chosen this. There is a kind of creature for whom a clean name and a comfortable lie are worth more than the rest of a life lived as a traitor and an exile, far from home, among the very people he was sent to destroy, knowing he could never go back. If I went, I would lose everything. My home, my name, my family almost certainly, because the Dominion does not forgive what I had done and would reach for them if it could not reach me. I would lose the whole architecture of belonging that a person builds across a life. I would be a creature with no people, having abandoned the only people I had ever had, to live out my span among strangers whose world I had helped to burn. The Sergeant Bran understood the choice before I did. He always understood things before I did. He had Mara aboard the craft already and Corin laid in the back and his soldiers ready, and he stood in the open hatch and he looked at me and he did not tell me to come. He did not beg me. He did not even encourage me. He simply said in that plain human way the truest thing, which was, it's a long life out there for a creature with no people, but you've got one now if you want it. He looked at the child and at his soldiers and at the wounded enemy they had carried, and he looked back at me. We're not much, but we don't leave our own behind. And after what you just did, that's what you are now. You're our own. He paused. Whether you come or not, that's what you are. I have turned that moment over more times than any other in my long life, and I have never found the bottom of it. After what you just did, that's what you are now. You're our own. He was not offering me forgiveness for my empire, or absolution for Resolute, or for the cities I had helped to burn, or for the crewmates I had passed in the corridors and not saved. He was not offering me anything I had earned. He was simply telling me what I had become by my own choosing, the way his whole species told each other the truth, plainly, as a thing that needed to be known. I had chosen to be a certain kind of creature, and the humans, who decided every day what kind of creatures they would be, had a name for that kind, and the name was one of us. I went. The little craft tore free of the dying asterisk quiet until asked on its crude chemical fire, and we fell away from the breaking fleet into the dark beyond the small gray moon. And through the small ports, I watched the end of the most powerful battle fleet the Dominion had ever sent. There is not much to say about the end of it that the saying does not cheapen. It came apart. 216 vessels of war, the perfect layered shell, the 900 cycles of unbroken doctrine, all of it tearing open in the dark under the patient, unstoppable arrival of everything a single young world had ever built to reach the sky, flung at us all at once by creatures who had each decided freely that this was the thing they would spend their lives to do. Sevis fell silent at some point. I do not know exactly when. The fleet mind that had never once been surprised had been surprised past the point of speech, and then past the point of being, and the certain flat voice that had promised us 6 days simply stopped, and was not heard in the galaxy again. The survivors fled. Not many. A scattering of vessels from the rear layers that turned and ran for the dark between the stars, carrying home the only cargo that mattered, the news. The news that the small blue world had not fallen. The news that a young species with no warships and no central command and no fear of death had met the Dominion's strongest fleet and broken it. The news that the arithmetic had been wrong, that everything we thought we understood about what humans were had been wrong, and that the galaxy was now a place where this was known. Earth was not conquered. It never was. The Dominion sent no second fleet, because the survivors carried home the one thing more powerful than any weapon, which was the understanding of what waited at that world, and what it would cost, and the cold certainty that there was no force in the Dominion's arsenal that could reach the thing that made a child hold a stranger's hand in the smoke. You do not conquer a species that fights for what it has decided to be. You only teach it that you are an enemy, and then you live forever after, in a galaxy where it knows your name and is awake. The little craft carried us down, eventually, to the world I had helped to burn. I will not tell you it was a gentle homecoming for me. It was not. The humans I came among did not all welcome me. Why would they? I was a creature of the empire that had killed their cities, and the fact that I had turned at the end did not give them back their dead, and many of them looked at me in the years that followed, with the look that Brant had not given me, the look that asks how dare you live when so many of ours do not. I do not blame them for it. I have asked myself the same question. But the Sergeant Brant kept his word, and so did his soldiers, and so, in time, did others. We're our own, and we don't leave our own behind. They had decided what I was, and they did not unmake the decision when it grew inconvenient, when other humans questioned it, when it would have been easier to quietly let the alien drift to the edges and be forgotten. They held to it the way they held to everything, plainly, stubbornly, as a thing they had chosen and would not surrender. And slowly, across years, I built among them the thing I had thought I lost forever when I tore my hand through that maintenance hatch. I built a people, not the one I was born to, a chosen one, and it held. The child Mara grew up. Bran had told me she would, one way or another, some of them always do, and she did. She grew up in a world that had been attacked from the stars and had not fallen, and she grew up knowing the strange creature who had bled to open a barrier on a dying ship, and she did not grow up to hate. That is the thing about them that I did not understand at the start and understand now as the deepest truth of what they are. We thought their attachments made them fragile. We thought their mercy made them weak. We were so completely wrong that I have spent a lifetime trying to find words for the size of the error. Their attachments did not make them fragile. Their attachments made them unconquerable. Their mercy was not weakness. Their mercy was the very thing that the strongest fleet in the galaxy could not break, because it was not a structure to be broken but a choice to be made, renewed every day, freely, in every one of them, faster than any empire could destroy it. Mara is old now, older than I expected to see her grow given their short spans. She has young ones of her own and young ones beyond those, and she tells them the story sometimes, I am told, the story of the night the sky fell and the strange creature who chose, against everything he was, to open a door. And I tell it too to my own young ones, the chosen ones, the ones I built a life among after I gave up the one I was born to. I tell them what I have told you. That an empire crossed half the galaxy to break a young species it had decided was fragile, and that it was wrong about everything, and that the wrongness was not an accident but a kind of blindness, the blindness of the strong and the certain, who look at love and call it weakness because they have forgotten, or never knew, that it is the only thing in the universe that does not break. They sent us to find out what humans were. They were so sure they already knew. Fragile, they said, divided, soft, easily broken, and every word of it was true, and not one word of it was the truth, and the difference between those two things is the whole of what I learned in the days that were never 6. Here is the truth, the one nobody told them, the one I would carry back across the dark and right across the sky of every world that still thinks of conquest if I could. Humans are not soft because they love. They are unconquerable because they love. You cannot break a creature whose strength was never in itself. You cannot make it surrender what it was never fighting to keep. And when you come for such a creature with all your fleets and all your certainty, you do not teach it to fear you. You only teach it your name, so it will know what to call the thing it has decided it will never, ever be. That is what humans truly are. Nobody told us. We should have asked.